When Governor Adler had come to power, and not long after Joshua was born in Chickasaw of Catawba, a party of Mayan clerics crossed the southern border and made their way to Jasper. They sought audience with the governor, confident he would already be advised regarding the basis for their pilgrimage. Gaining audience with the governor, they asked, "Where is the long-expected one prophesied to reign over all the inhabitants of the land?" "We have long been studying the skies and now learned of his recent birth. We have come to find and worship him. Please tell us where he is, that we may complete our quest and return home in peace and fulfillment." Adler was distressed with these words, as were every one of his advisors. The news they brought spread quickly, as these clerics had no thought to hide their mission, unaware of or unconcerned with the power struggles in the Adler administration. To give himself space to consider their request and determine the best path forward, he excused the clerics to confer with his advisors on the matter. As tumultuous as any of his administration's other conferences might have been, his entire cabinet was on highest alert in recognition of Adler's anxiety over this case. The state had dissolved term limits for the governorship, and he had no intention of relinquishing hold on power. His advisors were searching all they could find on the ancient prophecy before they could be convened, even. Their research pointed to Chickasaw as the likeliest birthplace for the child, and they set before Adler the prophetic text pointing there. "Hail, Chickasaw of Catawba, ignored among territories and despised by the powerful. There is more to you than meets the eye. The coming one ascends from your byways and alleys. Born in dishonor from the shadows of your walls, he rises to reign in greatness. He directs my people, feeding, guiding, and keeping them from harm all their days." Calling the clerics back in, Adler asked when the stars had first pointed to news of this birth. Hearing it had been a matter of months, he directed them to Chickasaw to seek out the infant. As the more precise location where they would be likely to find him. While his administration had been unaware of this birth, he visibly glowed with excitement over news of this birth for their benefit. He gave them directions and sent them merrily on their way, asking they keep him apprised of their search, so he might soon follow them to pay his own respects to this one who meant hope for the future. Taking encouragement from Adler's words and direction, the clerics began making their way to Chickasaw of Catawba, anxious to locate the focus of their pilgrimage. They prepared to inquire after children who had been born in recent months. As night fell and the stars began to appear, however, their spirits rose higher than before. For in them they recognized signs they were indeed on the right path, leading them directly to the child in question. They made their way in haste, and before the week was out, arrived in Chickasaw and found themselves at the very place where Nicky and Braden had found shelter for themselves and their young child. The clerics announced themselves to the couple, making use of interpreters who had traveled with them to ease communication along their journey. As Nicky and Braden had experienced more than once to this point, they heard these foreigners announcing wonders about the child under their care. Joshua was to be the focal point of divine redemption for all of humanity. He was the very hope of all nations, wrapped in a diaper and onesie. While Joshua's reached to stand on chubby legs, those clerics spoke wonders through their interpreters, presenting gifts to Joshua and his parents in concert with their declarations of his identity. Their gifts were those appropriate for presenting to a king, a prophet, a priest, and preparing a corpse for burial. The gifts themselves proclaimed who Joshua was and who Joshua would become. They anticipated the future set before him, as well as the reality into which he was already leaning. It is small wonder that Braden and Nicky were at a loss for how to respond to these strangers who had traveled hundreds of miles to make their way before this child, their son. As had been the case before, here was one more moment of wonder regarding God revealing such impactful things to some of the most unlikely seeming candidates, who then proclaimed these things to them. None of this made much sense. But how could Nicky and Braden deny what they were once again hearing of such great expectations placed upon their tiny child? The seer who had come to Nicky months ago, the one who had alerted Braden of Nicky's impending pregnancy, and God making a special claim upon the child. The migrant Latino agricultural workers, the chapel sexton, and the prophetess all found an echo in the words of these foreigners. They worshipped and celebrated a very different concept of God in language needing interpretation for them to understand. It seemed that from all sorts of nations and stations in life, people converged upon them to declare wonders most difficult to process. After a shared meal together, the clerics lay down to sleep near Nicky and Braden, but before they had a chance to finish their rest, they dreamed anew, alerting them to the danger posed behind Adler's smiling face, designed to charm them. Adler was a threat to this child and his parents, as they learned. Rather than communicating with the governor, they alerted Braden and Nicky to this announced threat and departed by a different route, seeking to avoid encounters with any of Adler's administration, leaving the country as quietly as possible. Meanwhile, Braden had his own dream, alerting him to the peril that awaited them there in Chickasaw at Adler's hands. Warned of the threat, Nicky and Braden fled for their own protection. Braden used resources presented by the clerics and they took rail passage for a distant state beyond Adler's reach, several border crossings away. They began setting up home in new surroundings, a new culture, and learning a new language. News reached them of a search for Joshua, with agents rounding up immigrant families with infants in and around Chickasaw for processing, detention, and deportation proceedings. It was apparent Adler was wielding anti-immigration sentiment to detain their family by trapping them within these immigration raids. While families were torn apart and ripped away from their homes, Joshua was sheltered in a new setting, far away. Braden and Nikki had no official status as refugees, but so they were. Establishing themselves in a new land, Braden secured work sufficient to meet their needs. With the passing of time, Braden had another dream, in which he learned of Adler's death, allowing them to return to their homeland. Following this dream, they began making their way back, but hearing that one close to Adler had risen to power, they were leery of returning to Chickasaw. So they made their way to Saturn instead. It was there Joshua was able to grow up and become part of the community his parents had once known. Over the passage of years, those signs pointing to Joshua's special place in the world seemed less significant. Yet they arose to memory from time to time. It would yet be years before they took on greater flesh. Meanwhile, his parents wondered what it would all mean and how they could relate to such a one in their midst.